In the summer of 2010, Charleston, South Carolina, was alive with the heat and charm of the southern landscape. Emily Davis, a 22-year-old college student, lived with her mother, Linda, and her stepfather, Robert, in a spacious colonial-style home on the outskirts of the city. Emily was a bright, ambitious young woman studying English literature at a local university. She was well-liked by her peers and had a close-knit group of friends. However, beneath her seemingly perfect exterior, Emily harbored a secret that threatened to destroy the very fabric of her family. Robert, her stepfather, was a successful businessman in his late 40s. He had married Linda 5 years earlier, after the death of Emily's father. With his charming demeanor and polished appearance, Robert quickly became a respected figure in the community. To outsiders, the Davis family appeared to be the epitome of stability and success. But behind closed doors, a dangerous and illicit affair was brewing. The relationship between Emily and Robert had always been close, even before the affair began. Robert often acted more like a friend than a father figure, taking Emily to dinner, discussing her studies, and even confiding in her about his business ventures. Over time, their bond deepened, and innocent interactions gradually evolved into something more sinister. The affair began innocently enough, a lingering touch here, a too-long glance there, but it quickly escalated. One evening, while Linda was away visiting relatives, Robert and Emily found themselves alone in the house. The tension between them was palpable, and without Linda's presence, they crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. What started as a stolen kiss quickly turned into a night of passion, sealing their fates. Emily, overwhelmed by a mix of emotions, was both exhilarated and horrified by what had happened. She knew it was wrong, but the thrill of the forbidden and her deep attraction to Robert kept her from breaking it off. Robert, on the other hand, was more calculated. He was aware of the risks, but his desire for Emily overshadowed any sense of morality or responsibility he might have had. The two lovers were meticulous in their efforts to keep the affair hidden. They met in secluded locations far from the prying eyes of Charleston's close-knit community. Robert rented a small, nondescript cabin on the outskirts of town, where they would rendezvous in secret. Emily began carrying a burner phone, which she used exclusively for communicating with Robert. The phone was always on silent, and she hid it in the bottom of her bag, ensuring that Linda would never find it. Despite their precautions, the affair took a toll on Emily. She struggled with overwhelming guilt, particularly when she saw how happy her mother seemed in her marriage to Robert. Linda, completely unaware of the betrayal unfolding under her roof, was focused on her marriage and her daughter's future. She often spoke about how lucky she felt to have found a man like Robert, who not only provided for them, but also seemed to genuinely care about Emily. As the weeks turned into months, the affair intensified. Emily became more withdrawn, distancing herself from her friends and focusing solely on her clandestine relationship with Robert. She skipped classes, avoided social gatherings, and spent every possible moment with him. Her grades began to slip, and her friends noticed the change in her behavior. But Emily deflected their concerns with vague excuses about being overwhelmed with schoolwork. Robert, on the other hand, maintained his facade of the devoted husband and stepfather. He continued to attend community events with Linda, playing the role of the perfect family man. His charm and charisma kept suspicions at bay, and no one in their social circle would have ever guessed the dark secret he was harboring. As the affair continued, Emily's guilt became almost unbearable. She knew that if Linda ever found out, it would destroy her mother. Yet despite this knowledge, Emily found herself unable to end the relationship. The illicit nature of the affair had created a powerful, addictive dynamic between her and Robert, one that neither of them seemed willing to break. Their secret world began to feel increasingly fragile as the affair dragged on. Every glance, every touch, every whispered word felt like a ticking time bomb, waiting to explode and shatter the life they had built. But even as they navigated this dangerous game, neither Emily nor Robert could have predicted the devastating consequences that were about to unfold. As the affair between Robert and Emily continued into the fall of 2010, the Davis household began to change in ways that Linda couldn't ignore. At first, the differences were subtle. Robert seemed more distracted, often lost in thought during their evening conversations. He began working late more frequently, claiming that his business was expanding and required his constant attention. Linda, a supportive wife, accepted his explanations, but a nagging feeling in the back of her mind told her something wasn't right. Emily, too, was behaving differently. She had always been close with her mother, but lately she seemed distant and preoccupied. She spent more time locked away in her room, often with the door closed and the blinds drawn. When Linda asked her about school, Emily would respond with vague, disinterested answers, avoiding eye contact and quickly changing the subject. Her once bright and engaging demeanor had turned somber, and she frequently appeared anxious, jumping at the sound of her phone and taking calls in hushed tones. Linda's suspicions began to grow when she overheard a phone call between Robert and someone she couldn't identify. It was late at night, and Linda had been on her way to the kitchen for a glass of water when she heard Robert's voice, low and urgent, coming from his study. The door was slightly ajar, and she could hear enough to know that the conversation was not about business. She caught phrases like, "We can't keep doing this," and "It's too risky." When she pushed the door open a bit more, Robert noticed and quickly ended the call, giving her a strained smile and an excuse about a difficult client. That night, Linda lay awake, replaying the conversation in her mind. Robert's behavior was becoming increasingly suspicious, and she couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. Her instincts told her that Robert was hiding something, and she began to pay closer attention to the small details she had previously overlooked. The first real clue came when Linda accidentally knocked over Robert's briefcase while tidying up the living room. As she bent down to pick up the scattered papers, she noticed a small, sleek phone that she had never seen before. It wasn't Robert's usual phone. This one was much simpler, almost like a burner phone. Linda's heart raced as she realized the implications. Who was he communicating with on a phone she didn't know existed? Linda didn't confront Robert immediately. Instead, she began to watch him more closely, looking for any other signs that might confirm her growing suspicions. She noticed that Robert had started receiving text messages late at night, messages he quickly deleted. He was also making more frequent trips out of town, always with a vague explanation about meetings or conferences. Each time he left, Emily would seem unusually tense, and Linda couldn't help but wonder if the two events were connected. Determined to uncover the truth, Linda began to quietly investigate. She started by checking the credit card statements, looking for any unusual charges. It didn't take long for her to find them. Dinners at expensive restaurants, hotel receipts from nearby towns, and even a purchase at a jewelry store that she knew nothing about. The receipts painted a picture of a man who was spending significant time and money on someone other than his wife. Linda's unease grew with each passing day. She searched through Robert's things when he wasn't home, looking for anything that might confirm her fears. One afternoon, she found a series of text messages on the hidden phone that were brief but intimate, clearly not meant for a business associate. The messages were unsigned and there was no name in the contacts, just a number. The messages were coded, but the undertone was unmistakable. Whoever was on the other end of that phone was someone Robert cared about deeply, someone he was willing to risk everything for. But despite all the evidence, Linda never suspected that the other person was her own daughter. Emily had always been so careful, using her burner phone only when she was away from home or at the secluded cabin with Robert. The messages Linda found were from Robert's phone, and they were deliberately vague enough that she couldn't be certain who the other person was. Linda's anxiety began to affect her daily life. She became more withdrawn, her thoughts consumed by the possible affair. She started questioning everything. Every trip Robert took, every time Emily left the house, every whisper she overheard. The tension in the house was palpable, and Linda found herself snapping at both Robert and Emily over trivial matters, her nerves frayed by the growing suspicion that her marriage was unraveling. As the days went on, Linda felt increasingly isolated, unable to share her concerns with anyone. She didn't want to confide in friends or family, fearing the shame and embarrassment that would come if her suspicions were true. Instead, she kept everything bottled up inside, her frustration and fear manifesting in sleepless nights and a growing sense of dread. The once warm and loving atmosphere of the Davis home had turned cold, the air thick with unspoken tension. Linda knew that she couldn't continue living in this state of uncertainty, but she wasn't ready to confront Robert just yet. She needed more proof, something undeniable that would force him to admit the truth. Little did she know that the truth was much closer to home than she could have ever imagined. By early November 2010, Linda Davis was at her breaking point. The mounting evidence of her husband's infidelity gnawed at her day and night. The secret phone, the cryptic text messages, the unexplained absences, all of it pointed to the fact that Robert was seeing someone else. But despite everything she had uncovered, she needed definitive proof. She needed to see it with her own eyes. One chilly evening, when Robert announced yet another late-night business meeting, Linda decided it was time to take matters into her own hands. She waited until he left, then quickly grabbed her coat and keys, determined to follow him. Her hands trembled as she drove, her mind racing with fear and anger. But she forced herself to stay calm, focusing on the taillights of Robert's car as he navigated through the winding roads of their small town. As she followed him, she noticed that he wasn't heading towards his office or any of the usual places he claimed to frequent. Instead, he drove out of town towards a secluded area on the outskirts that was known for its dense woods and private properties. Linda's heart pounded in her chest as she realized where he was going. There was only one place out there that Robert could be heading to, a remote cabin they had once rented for a weekend getaway, far from prying eyes. When Robert's car finally turned off the main road onto a narrow dirt path leading to the cabin, Linda slowed her pace, keeping a safe distance. She parked her car behind a cluster of trees and carefully made her way through the underbrush, the cold air biting at her skin. As she approached the clearing where the cabin stood, she froze. There, parked just outside the cabin, was Emily's car. For a moment, Linda's mind refused to process what she was seeing. She had expected to catch Robert with another woman, some stranger who had lured him away from their marriage. But Emily, her own daughter, the possibility was too horrifying to consider. But there it was, undeniable, a second car that could belong to no one else but Emily. Swallowing back a wave of nausea, Linda crept closer to the cabin, the fallen leaves crunching softly under her feet. She kept to the shadows, moving as silently as she could, until she reached one of the windows. The curtains were only partially drawn, allowing her a narrow view inside. What she saw through that small gap shattered her world completely. Robert and Emily were inside, standing close together by the fireplace. The soft glow of the flames cast flickering shadows on the walls, but there was no mistaking the intimacy of their embrace. Robert's hands rested on Emily's waist, pulling her close, while Emily looked up at him with an expression Linda had never seen before. An expression of love, desire, and something more. Before Linda could fully comprehend what was happening, Robert leaned down and kissed Emily, their bodies pressed together in a way that left no room for doubt. Linda staggered back from the window, her breath coming in short, ragged gasps. The scene she had just witnessed was so grotesque, so profoundly wrong, that her mind struggled to accept it as reality. The two people she loved and trusted most in the world had betrayed her in the most unimaginable way. The image of Robert and Emily together burned itself into her memory, a twisted vision that would haunt her forever. For a few agonizing moments, Linda stood there in the dark, her thoughts a chaotic whirlwind of shock, rage, and despair. She felt as though the ground had been ripped out from under her, leaving her free-falling into a void of pain and betrayal. But as the initial shock began to wear off, a new emotion took its place: cold, seething anger. Linda retreated from the cabin as quietly as she could, her mind reeling from the discovery. She knew she had to get away, to put as much distance between herself and that cabin as possible before she lost control. The drive back home was a blur, her thoughts spinning in every direction as she tried to make sense of what she had seen. How long had this been going on? How could Robert do this to her, to their family and Emily? How could her own daughter betray her in such a vile way? When Linda finally reached the safety of her home, she collapsed onto the couch, her entire body shaking. She felt sick to her core, the shock of what she had witnessed still numbing her senses. She was overwhelmed by a flood of emotions: grief for the marriage that was now irreparably shattered, fury at the betrayal by the two people she had trusted most, and confusion over what to do next. Linda spent the rest of the night in a daze, her mind unable to rest as she grappled with the enormity of the situation. Every time she closed her eyes, the image of Robert and Emily together replayed itself over and over, a nightmare from which there was no escape. She knew she couldn't keep this to herself, but the thought of confronting either of them, of bringing this dark secret into the light, filled her with dread. As dawn broke and the first light of day crept through the windows, Linda realized that nothing in her life would ever be the same. The truth she had uncovered was too terrible, too destructive to ignore. But how could she confront Robert? How could she face Emily? And what would happen to their family once the truth came out? One thing was certain. This dark secret couldn't stay hidden forever. Linda's discovery was the beginning of the end, a harbinger of the devastation that was about to tear their family apart. On the morning of November 3rd, 2010, Linda Davis awoke with a heavy heart and a mind filled with turmoil. The discovery of her husband Robert and her daughter Emily's affair the previous night had left her reeling. As the dawn broke, Linda knew that she could no longer keep her anger and betrayal contained. She needed answers, and more importantly, she needed to confront the two people who had shattered her world. Linda's mind raced with a mix of dread and determination as she prepared for the confrontation. She made no effort to conceal her emotions. The raw pain and fury she felt were evident in her every move. She paced through the kitchen, gripping a coffee cup tightly, the ceramic surface cold against her trembling fingers. Her eyes were bloodshot, and her normally composed demeanor was replaced by an intensity fueled by the trauma of her discovery. By 9 a.m., Linda had resolved that she could not wait any longer. She knew that confronting Robert and Emily together would be the only way to truly address the betrayal that had occurred. She planned to confront them directly, no matter the cost. She took a deep breath, bracing herself for the confrontation she had been dreading. As Linda entered the living room, where Robert and Emily were sitting, she noticed immediately how different the atmosphere was. The room, which had always been a symbol of domestic tranquility, now felt oppressive and charged with an underlying tension. Robert was seated at the breakfast table, scrolling through his phone with a distracted expression. Emily sat across from him, her face pale and apprehensive. Linda's presence was like a sudden storm breaking out on a clear day. Without preamble, she strode into the room, her eyes blazing with a mixture of anger and heartbreak. The kitchen knife she had been holding was now hidden behind her back, but the tension in her grip was palpable. "Robert, Emily," Linda said, her voice tight with emotion. "I need answers. How long has this been going on? How could you do this to me? To our family?" Robert looked up, his face going from casual indifference to confusion, and then to alarm as he saw the look in Linda's eyes. Emily's face, already flushed with anxiety, turned a shade whiter. Both of them could see that Linda was on the edge of losing control. "We were going to talk about this," Robert began, his tone defensive. "Linda, let's just sit down and—" "No!" Linda interrupted, her voice rising. "I saw everything last night. I saw the two of you together in the cabin. How could you betray me like this? And Emily, my own daughter." Emily's attempt to speak only made things worse. "Mom, please let me explain. It's not what it looks like." Linda's anger reached a boiling point. Her vision narrowed, focusing solely on Robert, who was now standing up, trying to calm her down. The emotional storm inside Linda was overwhelming, and her thoughts were consumed by the betrayal. In a moment of blind rage, she reached for the kitchen knife she had been gripping tightly in her hand. The knife had been intended for preparing breakfast, but now became an instrument of her vengeance. Before Robert could react, Linda lunged at him. The knife slashed through the air, its blade catching the light as it sliced through Robert's shirt and into his flesh. Robert's eyes widened in shock and pain as he stumbled backward, trying to fend off Linda's relentless attacks. He tried to block the knife with his arms, but Linda's fury drove her to stab him repeatedly, each thrust of the blade driven by her profound sense of betrayal. Emily, frozen in shock, watched the scene unfold with a horrified expression. Her pleas for her mother to stop were drowned out by the sound of the knife hitting flesh and the screams of pain from Robert. She moved to intervene, but the violence of the moment was too intense, and her actions were futile against the sheer force of Linda's rage. Robert collapsed onto the floor, the life draining from him as Linda continued to stab him, her breath coming in ragged bursts. The once proud businessman lay on the ground, blood pooling around him, a stark contrast to the bright morning sun filtering through the windows. Linda's hands were slick with blood, and the knife, now stained with crimson, fell from her grasp as she staggered back, her breathing heavy and uneven. The horrific scene left Emily and Linda in a state of disbelief. Emily fell to her knees beside Robert's body, her face contorted with a mix of shock and grief. Linda stood a few feet away, her chest heaving, her mind struggling to process the enormity of her actions. The room, once a place of family harmony, had become a crime scene marked by violence and bloodshed. Linda and Emily stared at each other across the room, the reality of what had just occurred settling in. The silence was punctuated only by the occasional, ragged breath and the distant sound of traffic outside. The betrayal that had started with a secret affair had culminated in an act of deadly violence, leaving both women facing the ruins of their family and the haunting consequences of their choices. As the gravity of the situation began to sink in, Linda and Emily were left to grapple with the aftermath of the confrontation. The events of that morning had irrevocably changed their lives, setting the stage for the unraveling of their family's darkest secrets and the investigation that would follow. On the morning of November 3, 2010, the aftermath of Robert Davis's murder unfolded with a grim and chaotic efficiency. As Linda Davis and her daughter Emily stood in the midst of the horror they had created, the reality of the situation began to set in. Emily, still in shock and barely able to process the gravity of the events, stumbled to her phone and dialed 911. Her voice, trembling with fear and disbelief, informed the dispatcher of the violent incident that had just occurred. The call was placed at approximately 9:45 a.m. Emily's description was disjointed, revealing the panic and confusion that had engulfed her. Within minutes, police department officers arrived at the Davis residence. The first responders, led by Detective John Harrison, were met with a scene of carnage. Robert Davis's body was found in the living room, lying in a pool of blood. The victim had multiple stab wounds across his torso and arms, the result of a frenzied and brutal attack. The knife used in the assault was found nearby, covered in blood. Linda Davis was still present at the scene, standing by the kitchen counter, her clothing stained with blood. She was visibly disoriented and emotionally detached from the chaos surrounding her. The officers immediately placed her under arrest, noting her unsteady demeanor and the blood-soaked kitchen knife. Linda was handcuffed and read her rights before being escorted out of the house. Emily, meanwhile, was taken aside and questioned as a witness. Detective Harrison and his team conducted an initial interview with her in the living room, where they documented her account of the events. Emily's statements were fragmented and emotional, detailing the argument that had erupted between her mother and Robert and the subsequent violence. As news of the murder spread, local media outlets quickly descended on the Davis residence. The story of the brutal killing and the ensuing arrest of Linda Davis captured the attention of the community. Richmond's small-town atmosphere was rocked by the scandal, and the case became the subject of intense media scrutiny. News channels reported on the shocking details, and journalists camped outside the Davis home, eager for any updates on the unfolding tragedy. The police investigation began in earnest. Detective Harrison, with his team of forensic experts, meticulously collected evidence from the crime scene. Blood samples, fingerprints, and the bloody knife were all documented and sent to the crime lab for analysis. The forensic team also conducted a search of the Davis home, uncovering additional evidence that painted a sordid picture of the family's recent history. Among the evidence found were personal journals and correspondence between Linda and Robert, revealing their troubled relationship and the strained dynamics within the family. Further investigation uncovered Emily and Robert's secret affair. Text messages and phone records revealed that Emily and Robert had been involved in an illicit relationship that had been carefully concealed. The detectives interviewed neighbors, friends, and acquaintances, piecing together the timeline of events leading up to the murder. As the investigation progressed, the details of the affair and the subsequent murder became increasingly public. The media coverage was relentless, portraying the case as a dramatic and scandalous family tragedy. Linda Davis's arrest and the revelations about the affair led to widespread shock and speculation. The story of betrayal, violence, and the shattered family was dissected in news reports, adding to the intense public interest. Emily, now grappling with the fallout from the murder, faced public scrutiny and personal anguish. She was seen as a key witness in the case, and her role in the tragedy became a subject of intense media focus. The psychological impact of the events on Emily was profound, as she struggled to cope with the loss of her stepfather, her mother's arrest, and the collapse of her family life. The chapter closed with the community in turmoil and the investigation continuing. Linda Davis remained in police custody, facing charges of first-degree murder. The case had not only torn apart a family, but also captivated the attention of a small town grappling with the shock of a crime that seemed to defy belief. The trial of Linda Davis began on February 12, 2011. The courtroom was packed with journalists, local residents, and legal professionals, all eager to witness the proceedings of a case that had captured the attention of the community and media alike. The case was officially named Commonwealth versus Linda Davis, and it would become one of the most sensational trials of the year. Linda Davis faced charges of first-degree murder for the killing of her husband, Robert Davis. The prosecution, led by Assistant District Attorney Maria Collins, presented a compelling case against Linda. The prosecution's strategy focused on establishing Linda's motive, her discovery of Robert's affair with their daughter Emily, and the subsequent violent outburst that led to Robert's death. The prosecution's case was built on several key pieces of evidence. 1. Evidence from the crime scene. The prosecution highlighted the brutal nature of the crime. Photographs and forensic reports were presented, showing the multiple stab wounds inflicted on Robert Davis. The bloody kitchen knife and Linda's stained clothing were central pieces of evidence, underscoring the violence of the attack. Linda's confession. The prosecution used Linda's confession, given during the initial police interrogation, as a crucial element of their case. In her statement, Linda admitted to attacking Robert in a fit of rage, though she claimed it was provoked by discovering the affair. Her confession, combined with physical evidence, was powerful in implicating her. 3. Testimony from Emily Davis. Emily was called to testify about the events leading up to the murder. Her testimony was emotional and difficult, as she recounted discovering her mother's suspicions and the tumultuous argument that escalated into violence. Emily described the tension within the family and the devastating impact of the affair on their relationships. Affair evidence. The prosecution presented evidence of the affair between Emily and Robert. Text messages, phone records, and private correspondence were introduced to establish the relationship's existence and its role in the family's collapse. The defense, led by attorney William Ross, argued that Linda's actions were a result of extreme emotional distress. The defense portrayed Linda as a victim of betrayal and pointed to her unstable mental state at the time of the murder. They attempted to mitigate the severity of Linda's actions by framing them as an outburst caused by an overwhelming emotional crisis rather than premeditated murder. The trial proceeded with a series of witness testimonies, including character witnesses who spoke to Linda's generally good nature and her history as a caring wife and mother. The defense sought to highlight Linda's previous contributions to the community and her otherwise peaceful life. The courtroom drama reached its peak when the jury began deliberations. After a week of intense legal arguments and emotional testimonies, the jury returned with a verdict on February 23, 2011. Linda Davis was found guilty of first-degree murder. The verdict was met with mixed reactions from the public, reflecting the complexity of the case and the conflicting emotions it stirred. During the sentencing phase, Linda's defense argued for leniency, citing her emotional state and the tragic circumstances surrounding the murder. However, the judge, after considering the severity of the crime and the impact on the victim's family, sentenced Linda to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The sentence was handed down on March 1, 2011, marking the end of a tumultuous legal process. In the months following the trial, Emily struggled to cope with the fallout from the events. The media frenzy surrounding the case had faded, but the personal impact on Emily remained profound. She was left to confront the shattered remnants of her family life and the emotional scars left by the betrayal and violence. In September 2011, Emily visited Linda at the state prison where Linda was serving her sentence. The meeting was emotionally charged and difficult for both women. Emily struggled to reconcile the mother she had known with the woman convicted of murder. Linda, in turn, faced the consequences of her actions and the reality of spending the rest of her life behind bars. As Emily left the prison, she reflected on the choices that had led to the tragic outcome. The affair, the murder, and the subsequent trial had exposed the fragility of their family bonds and the destructive power of secrets. Emily understood that the price of their actions had been steep, and the consequences of their choices had irrevocably altered their lives.